Magic and Mystery by Allegory for Hatred. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. 49 Blaze considers getting Dazai a therapist. Something was off about Dazai, Blaze thought. Well, more off than normal. After all, there was nothing usual about Dazai Osamu on a regular day. The boy was covered head to toe in bandages, wore a smile like it was a disguise, and thought deceit was an amusing pastime. There were about 100 things about Dazai that left Blaze asking, "What's really going on here?" and about 100 more making him think, something is severely wrong with this kid. But here, right now, something more was wrong with Dazai. For one, Blaze was almost certain his fellow Slytherin had a headache. Again, because Dazai rarely ever didn't have a headache. And as concerning as that was, Blaze had become very accustomed to seeing his friend in constant pain. It hadn't been until just the other night, outside the infirmary. Professor Snape looked between Blaze and Draco, eyes narrowed more in consideration than his usual disdain. "You are not to practice magic with Mr. Dazai any longer," Snape had said seriously. "If you see him using magic without a teacher's guidance, you are to stop him immediately." "Is Dazai okay?" Draco had asked then, for what must have been the third time. The look on Professor Snape's face had been anywhere from no to I don't know, and that stopped them talking faster than any. What did I say about asking questions? Ever could. Blaze shook away the memory by walking up to Dazai and keeping better pace. He would keep an eye on his friend better now. So he kept his eyes locked on Dazai as they traveled through the stone hall. A careful, discerning gaze, the type that uncovered someone's secrets merely by looking. Dazai was a hard nut to crack, but Blaze was patient. Exceptionally so. After all, one couldn't be friends with Dazai without also having incredible amounts of patience. It wasn't long before they made it to the end of the hall. Almost immediately, everyone's heads shot up. The room was massive, a ceiling disappearing somewhere far, far overhead. But the sheer size of the room was hardly what kept Blaze's attention long. No, it was the swarm of keys filling the space up. 100, 1,000 small metal keys dashed around the sky. Each key wore a pair of small fairies' wings that flitted and zipped at a hummingbird's pace. Just when Blaze thought he was tracking the movement of a key, it was halfway across the room the next second. Blaze opened his mouth to say something, but his eyes caught on Dazai instead. Dazai, who was decidedly not watching the impressive flying display overhead. Instead, the other boy was squinting at the far wall. There was a pinch in Dazai's brow, like he had an itch he couldn't scratch. When Blaze turned to see what had captured his friend's attention he saw a small, unassuming wooden door. On its handle, there was a huge golden lock. Blaze frowned. "How do we know which key is the right fit?" he asked, looking to Dazai for answers first, then the twins. A small silver key danced between them, then disappeared somewhere overhead. "Dunno," Fred said. "Ooh, here are the brooms. Take a look, George." Jerking away from where he'd been watching a particularly large key, George hurried to his brother's side. He shot Blaze and Dazai a reassuring look and a double thumbs up. "We've got this. Don't worry about a thing. Have a nice sit-down, maybe," Fred chimed in. "Better yet, take a nap." "Oh, well, leave it to the twins," Blaze supposed. It was nice to have such a reliable duo around. Merlin knew that if it had been Draco to come with them, his only contribution would have been to brag about his flying skills. Or maybe that was threatened to sue the school. Regardless. "What do you think, Dazai?" Blinking out of his thoughts, Dazai whirled away from the door. Blaze felt his eyes narrow. To his left, he briefly saw the twins mounting their brooms. "About this guard?" he asked, then thought better. "Are you okay?" Dazai blinked, and Blaze held back a sigh. "I'm fine. What a weird question." Dazai huffed out after a second. He turned back to the door and tilted his head. Then, for some reason, his face scrunched up. Blaze stared at him for a long moment until Dazai finally explained, "That thing is charmed to all hell and back, I think." Blaze kept the surprise from appearing on his face. When he turned and squinted at the door, he couldn't sense a thing. He bit his tongue. Huh. Letting out a weary breath, Dazai glanced back to Blaze. He offered a sheepish smile. Guess we'll just have to wait for the twins to find the right key. No amount of Alohomora is going to open that door. You don't know how to cast Alohomora. Dazai shrugged. Then, without another word, he walked to the closest wall and slid down until he was sitting. After a moment, Blaze joined him. He watched as Dazai drew his knees up to his chest and laid his head down there. He just sat there, wrapped up into himself, as if everything in the world was painful. So Dazai's headache clearly wasn't on the mend then. Blaze sighed and dropped his head back into the stone wall. He watched the twins for a long moment in silence. They were floating a few feet off the ground. Every so often, one of them would point to a flying key and the other would shake his head. So those two were taking this seriously. Good. At the thought, Blaze cast a surreptitious glance back to Dazai. The other boy was still hunched into himself. With his eyes closed like that, anyone would think that Dazai had taken the twins' advice to nap, but Blaze knew better. He'd spent enough time with Dazai to know when the snake was actually resting and when he just wanted to look like he was resting. There was a crease in Dazai's brow, and every so often he would lift his eyes and squint at nothing in particular. No, Dazai wasn't resting at all. He was deep in thought, and that was something else that had been nagging at Blaze for a while. How quickly Dazai's perspective had shifted. After winter break, he had been cheerful, eager to steal the stone and prove to Professor Quirrell who was the better mafioso. And then, like flipping a switch, he wasn't. Dazai returned from his midnight adventure with Hermione, and suddenly he was making these serious faces all the time. Even after Dazai had filled their gang in on what the stone was, he still couldn't place exactly what had changed Dazai so much. Blaze had wanted to ask, had tried asking with his mouth half open and ready to say, "Something about this scares you, doesn't it?" But before Blaze had even gotten one word out, Dazai was making that face again. Sometimes Dazai's eyes could go eerily blank, and that scared Blaze. They didn't talk about it. Blaze still hadn't worked up the courage to actually ask. But he did steal Dazai's knife when the boy's dark expressions became darker still. He couldn't regret taking the knife. But now, sitting side by side with that morbid expression, Blaze sort of wished he had asked. Fred spotted something overhead. George patted his brother hard on the back, and they both shot into the air grinning. "Dazai," Blaze said after a second. His voice was calm and mellow, in the same way it always was. Dazai hummed distractedly. Blaze watched him with a careful eye, an expert in Dazai's minuscule expressions. But Dazai held perfectly still like his mind was elsewhere. He took in that empty gaze for a long moment and tried to pick the right words to say. "You scared me," was what Blaze finally decided on. This time, Dazai lifted his head to meet Blaze's gaze. His brows were pressed together like he was confused. It wasn't a second later that Dazai replaced that look with one of vague amusement. "Blaze is saying all sorts of strange things today. Should I have left you upstairs to babysit Egg? Isn't that Ron's job?" Blaze asked lightly. When Dazai made a sound of acknowledgement, he continued. "Earlier, with the dog, Hagrid's guard. You scared me." The sound of wind chimes of 1,000 clinking keys echoed around the room. Blaze bit his tongue when, after a long moment, Dazai had yet to reply. "You're still bothered by it. Anyone could see that you're still panicking, lost in your head, worried when just minutes before you seemed so certain." Abruptly, Dazai turned away. His gaze briefly lingered on the twins before falling to the floor. "Ah, Blaze is mean, pointing it out like that." "Sorry," Blaze hummed, letting some warm concern linger on his words. "Don't be," Dazai said. There was an odd inflection in his voice. It took a second for Blaze to pinpoint that emotion. When he did, his heart sank. Dazai craned his neck to beam in Blaze's direction. A wide, toothy smile split across his features. Sharp, pointed, and to anyone's eye, full of genuine happiness. With his eyes pressed closed like that, Dazai's smile looked honest. Blaze froze in place, suddenly feeling cold. "That's fake," he said, numb. Dazai hummed and leaned back into his knees. That horrible, brilliant smile of his didn't falter. "Sure, but you believed it for a second, didn't you?" He had, and it scared Blaze more than Dazai's empty gazes ever could. Dazai held the smile for another long moment, then slipped into a more casual, amused grin. Blaze tried to find where the look went brittle and fake. There was a pit in his stomach when he realized it didn't look like a lie at all. Dazai giggled, and Blaze thought, there's the lie. "I don't like dogs," Dazai explained. "I told you that." When Blaze nodded, the boy continued, "I didn't realize it would bother me that much. I don't know why I'm still letting that thing hang around in my brain like this." Dazai paused, like every word he chose was a war. "So don't fuss over it. I'll get over myself eventually. That's—" Blaze blinked. "Concerning," he wanted to say, but didn't. Dazai must have seen it on his face anyway, because his grin stretched a little wider, more frantic. Blaze took a silent breath. "Stupid," Dazai finished for him. "I was going to say an interesting perspective, but okay," Blaze huffed. He turned a serious eye onto where Dazai's nails were digging into the skin of his wrist. "Dazai, I don't think being afraid of dogs is something you should be ashamed of. Everyone has fears. I'm not ashamed." Blaze raised a brow. Dazai let out an annoyed breath. "Pretending you aren't scared seems like a bad idea, in the long run. You're living in denial, if you want to keep acting like you don't have emotions," Blaze said. He paused. "I won't ask you to tell me why you hate dogs so much, but you know it's normal to not immediately recover from something like that, right? You always push yourself too hard, boss." Dazai blinked at him, long and slow like Blaze's words were a foreign concept. Finally, Dazai let his mockery of a smile collapse. He bent forward, hiding his face in the bend of his knees. Blaze tried not to let his sigh of relief be too obvious. They sat like that for a moment. Blaze let his words hang in the air, mingling with the flutter of wings and the rattle of keys. The twins were soaring together overhead. Every few seconds they would split apart as if they were hurting something. The keys flashed around. A murmuration of steel. Muffled below cloth, Blaze barely caught Dazai's words when the boy at last spoke up. "Gross," Blaze snorted. "Feelings aren't gross, Dazai." "Are too," Dazai whined, petulant. "I don't like them at all. And if Blaze was nicer, he would agree with me." Blaze let a small, fond smile slip onto his face. Dazai picked his head off of his knees. When he saw the expression on Blaze's face, his nose scrunched up into an exaggerated pout. "Stop that." "Looking at you? Making that face," Dazai hissed. "You're making a face like you have feelings, even though we just agreed that feelings are gross. Try looking apathetic again." "You used to be really good at that." "Well," Blaze said, amused. "You bring out the worst in me, I suppose." Dazai smiled thinly, and his fingers worked at the peeling flesh by his nails. Nothing new there. Blaze frowned, feeling like he'd misstepped somewhere. But before he could backtrack the conversation, Dazai was pushing it elsewhere. "For the mountain troll, we're going to just have to run past it. Unless you were keen on fighting it. Not particularly," Blaze said with a resigned sigh. "I guess we can't rely on your accidental magic again, can we?" Dazai made an amused sound. "Not unless you want to carry me through the other guards. I already have a headache, so anything big like that will knock me out," he admitted with a coy grin. Professor Snape's voice echoed in Blaze's head again, and the objection was on his tongue before he even considered an alternative. "Absolutely not. That's what I thought." Nodding, Blaze considered their options. After taking a second to think, he asked, "Running, huh? Are trolls fast?" "Sort of. They have long legs." Dazai blinked out at the twins. He wore a thoughtful frown, and Blaze couldn't help but wonder if the other boy was remembering his last experience with a troll. Whatever had happened on that night between himself, a mountain troll, and a frankly horrifying display of accidental magic, remembering that day. It still put a sick feeling in Blaze's stomach. When Dazai came stumbling into the library with blood running over his mouth, held upright only by Draco's support, it had completely thrown him. On that day, and on many days since then, Blaze had thought, something is wrong with Dazai. Halloween was just another of those things that kept Blaze thinking, when is someone going to talk about that? Nothing about this is normal. But no one ever did, because Dazai's smiles were distracting even when they weren't especially convincing. Looking at him now, something flickered in Dazai's eyes, and a sharp grin suddenly worked its way onto his features. Blaze sat up straighter. You just had an idea. He paused. Should I be worried? Not this time, Dazai said easily. Laying his head back down on his knees, he watched over the twins with half-lidded eyes. Hummed. Are those two good at flying? I can't tell. Fred and George swerved around a cluster of keys. A swarm of keys was chasing after them, trying to batter the brooms from their grips. But the twins didn't seem to care. If anything, they looked to be having fun. Blaze watched as Fred, laughing, did an impressive spin on his broom to smack a dozen keys out of the air. They made the Gryffindor Quidditch team as beaters, Blaze said by way of answer. Tryouts were rough, he knew, because almost every student at Hogwarts wanted a place in their house's Quidditch team. That both the twins made the team was telling enough. I've been to a few of their games, he added in response to Dazai's nonplussed look. They're pretty good. By necessity, Blaze skipped most of the Quidditch matches. One way or another, keeping track of Dazai had always taken precedence. And Dazai, for his part, seemed to have taken zero interest in the broom sport. Maybe that was for the best. After all, the games tended to be a loud, energetic affair, and Dazai could barely tolerate a crowded great hall. Dazai tilted his head in acknowledgement. As they watched, the twins flew around the cavernous room. Even though the swarm of keys was chasing them down, Fred and George were flipping and twirling like it was all some game to them. Again, Fred split off for a split second to bash the back of his broom into some of the keys. They clattered onto the stone floor noisily, but didn't get back up. Now that Blaze was really looking at them and not at Dazai, he realized that almost all of the flying keys were rendered useless on the floor, the charm literally beaten out of them. Oh. Blaze made a small noise, impressed. When Dazai turned to him, a look of confusion behind his ever-dark eyes, Blaze explained. In Quidditch, the beaters are the ones who bat the bludgers, big cannonball-looking things, away from the other players. Fred and George don't have a bat, but they're pretty nifty with the brush of their brooms. In point, Blaze gestured to George. The twin flipped upside down and used his broom hit another dozen keys to the floor. Dazai oohed. Then, almost laughingly, he commented, I didn't realize Quidditch was such a violent game. Sometimes. Blaze lifted his chin. But the beaters are good at their job. People don't usually get hit. Usually. Blaze shrugged, hiding his own amusement by tuning his gaze back to the twins. Damn! Dazai snapped his head back, pouting against the stone wall. I can't believe I've been missing out on a blood sport all this time. It's not a blood sport. Hey, has anyone gotten knocked off their broom since the school year started? Blaze rolled his eyes. No. Well, at least I haven't missed anything exciting then. Mimicking Dazai's relaxed posture, Blaze rolled his head against the wall to blink down at the shorter Slytherin. Carefully, he said, There are still a few games left this year, and I hear the championship match is always especially intense. Dazai perked up. Really? For a second, Dazai didn't say anything at all. Then, grinning cheekily, he turned back to the twins. There were only 5 keys left now. Hey, after we get the stone, I think I'll go to a game. Blaze blinked. There was something warm and fond bubbling up in his chest. I'll save us a quiet seat near the professors then. And we can make bets on who gets the most blood on their broom. Sure. Blaze let out an amused breath. He really couldn't say no to Dazai, could he? As long as the professors don't hear. Dazai waved him off. Nah. I'll get them to place bets, too. I'm pretty convincing, you know. Blaze did know that. After all, Dazai was convincing him right now, tricking him into forgetting about their earlier conversation. But that was fine with Blaze. He didn't need to solve anyone's problems or fix Dazai's broken smiles. As long as they were standing side by side in one piece, Blaze was content with that. Hey, you two! Blaze and Dazai's heads snapped up and away from one another. Fred and George beamed down at them from their brooms, hovering a few feet off the air. They each wore a few scrapes and scratches. Behind them, dozens of broken and twitching keys were piled together. Blaze felt his eyes narrow. Fred and George were looking oddly serious, even with those smiles on. Maybe they had an important conversation of their own, too. Enjoy your break? George asked. He held up a small silver key and gave it a little wave. You got the right key, Dazai said, pushing himself upright. Good job. Fred and George preened at the compliment. Without another word, they both lowered their brooms to the ground and held them at their sides. What were you guys talking about? Fred asked, stepping forward to help Blaze to his feet. Blaze took the offered hand with a grateful bow of his head. Once he was standing, he took a step towards Dazai's side once again. The bandaged boy grinned. Blaze was just saying about how good at flying you both are, Dazai said, smirking to himself. I think he's secretly your biggest fan. Do you give autographs? Blaze shot him a deadpan look, but couldn't ignore the relief in his chest at seeing Dazai cheerful and joking again. It was such a far cry from the shaken Dazai moments earlier. Fred and George started laughing, but before they could drag the conversation on longer, Dazai commandeered their focus. Well, maybe once we're done, he said, shooting a small glance in Blaze's direction. Ooh, did you get more responsible since we last spoke, Snakey? Dazai rolled his eyes. Something like that. Just put the key in the door already, and bring those broomsticks with you. They might come in handy. As a group, they walked over to the door. The massive lock hung there, empty. Even standing this close, Blaze couldn't tell just what Dazai had seen earlier. He didn't sense any magic on the door, though surely there was some. It must have just been intuition then. Dazai was smart like that. 3 down, Dazai said. Blaze met his eye. 3 to go. George held the key up to the lock, but before he slipped it in, he paused. Slowly he asked, Are we ready? A series of serious nods answered him. Then, with a steady hand, George inserted the key. Click. 50 King's Gambit. The room opened up before them. It was another massive stone room, although this one was significantly less towering than the key room had been. Dazai skimmed his eyes around the space, looking for an immediate threat. He didn't find a troll, which was a relief, but he did see, At his side, Blaze twitched. When Dazai turned to him, the other boy was wearing an amused-looking smirk. Dazai had to agree, so he let a tiny laugh bubble up in his chest. Spread out before them was a supersized chessboard. Black and white tiles lined the floor, filled up with their usual set of players. They stood 3 times Dazai's height and twice as wide. Each piece stood tall, their features stern and stone. The gang came to a halt just before reaching the board. Dazai stared up at the black backs of the pieces. The king, which was so familiar a touch under his fingers, was now a towering, conniving figure. Its stone fingers were woven together in a look that reminded Dazai too much of a scheming Mori. He looked away quickly. Beside it, the bishop held a scepter thin and black. The knights rode on their riding horses. The castle stood in rigid defense, and the pawns hunched in loyal servitude. To see it all spread out before him, Dazai couldn't help but feel a thrill of eager. Although, his eyes narrowed. Chess? The twins asked, breaking Dazai from his observations. We have to win a game of giant chess? Blaze and Dazai met one another's knowing eyes once again. Looks like it, Blaze said, taking a tentative step towards the board. Dazai hummed, lowly, until Blaze stopped walking and turned back to him. This one must be Professor McGonagall's guard, George piped up. He was looking at the pieces with a searching look in his eyes. I don't see any potions around, at least. Dazai nodded, then tilted his head back. He had thought it before, and he still thought it now. Quirrell would make a horrible chess player. There was no way this was his guard. Which really only left McGonagall. Dazai didn't have a hard time believing that. The Transfiguration Professor had always struck Dazai as someone who was clever enough to play a mean game of chess. She also had incredibly high standards that were strict and unflinching in class. Well, discounting Dazai. Ever since the Night of the Dragon, she'd been just as careful with him as everyone else had become. Regardless, Dazai thought, this won't just be a simple match. If Professor McGonagall made her guard a chess game, she must be good. We'll be up against a tough opponent. As good as you? Blaise asked after a second. There was a trill of light amusement in his tone, and Dazai felt his lips twitch upwards in response. The two of them had shared no small amount of chess games together, and not once had Blaise managed a win against Dazai. You wound me. Dazai fake-whined. You know I'm unbeatable, Blaise. Except against Mori. But Mori was different. Because Mori always played white and held a scalpel-sharp smile behind crisscrossed fingers. Anyway, Dazai said haltingly, eager to distract those thoughts. This game might be a little different than we're used to. He didn't wait for a reply before motioning to the massive tile floor before them. See? 2 of the spaces are empty. It was glaringly obvious, something that had piqued Dazai's interest immediately after seeing the board. Where a black bishop should had stood, there was an empty tile. Further down the board, a similarly empty spot singled out a missing castle. The twins, blinking, looked the board over. They are missing. Are we supposed to win without them? Blaise hummed. Even before the boy spoke, Dazai predicted his next question. Dazai, what do you think? There it was. Dazai frowned, thoughtful. Blaise was making a habit of asking for his boss's advice, and Dazai couldn't say he hated it. It was a familiar role, at least. Looking to your betters to know what to do. Yes, Dazai was very familiar with that. Something pierced through Dazai's chest at the thought, and he turned back to the board quickly. Squinting, no longer human burned in the base of Dazai's skull. He let out a breath. I think. Dazai forced some good cheer into his voice. Are you up for a game, Blaise? When they all turned to face him, no small amount of interest in their eyes, Dazai continued. 2 places empty for 2 players. You strike me as a castle, so I'll take the bishop. One by one, their eyes flashed from Dazai, to the board, then back. Blaise was the one to speak first, something like realization alight in his eyes. We're the pieces? Dazai beamed, rolling back on his heels. He couldn't help it. He was feeling a little excited again. If not by chance, then by force. The smile on his face was pulled tight at the edges, earlier with the dog. Then Blaise's serious eyes, staring him down with blatant, drowning concern. Dazai was good at avoiding conversations like that. He would smile and tell a joke, then get away before the conversation took a too serious turn. But lately he'd been slipping. Maybe Hogwarts was making him soft. Between Pomfrey, Snape, the twins, and Blaise, Dazai was surrounded by people who just wouldn't stop fussing over him. It was so viscerally different from life at the Port Mafia that Dazai was still somehow caught off guard every single time. Worst of all, he almost didn't hate it. Knowing that Blaise had his back even when Dazai was panicking about something stupid like a dog made him feel. And did it ever hurt to think this safe? So, settling a grin over his face, Dazai resolved to suck it up and finish these guards. He didn't have time to be fawned over, despite Blaise's near-constant glances. More than that, he couldn't be productive if he was off his game. And if Blaise could read through his dead smile that easily, Dazai was certainly off his game. But chess, Dazai could do chess. After all, chess was his game. Avoid Professor Snape, hatch a dragon's egg, steal the stone, Check. Check. Almost check. 2 of 3 done. Dazai needed to stay out of his head and finish this. And who better to do this with than his loyal second-in-command? Dazai turned an almost smile onto Blaze. Play with me? Blaze blinked. Then, a slight grin split across his face. On the same side, I may finally have a chance at winning, Dazai snorted. From where they were standing, the twins looked amused as well. Fred leaned over to rest his arm on George's shoulder casually. They shared matching smirks. "Aw, looks like we'll be sitting this one out, George. Our baby brother is all grown up." Dazai shot them a look, but it didn't feel at all scathing. Nodding to himself, Dazai told them, "Why don't you two sit down somewhere? Take a nap." When they laughed, he added in a more serious voice, "But stay away from the board. I'm fairly sure you'll get hurt." Abruptly, the twins stopped laughing. Fred shot a nasty side-eye at the chess pieces, but even the pawns didn't quake under his glare. "Are you two going to be safe?" he asked after a second. "Sure," Dazai waved them off, glancing to the board himself. Sure enough, the pieces were absolutely full of magic, even more than the charmed door in the last room had been. Just being near the chessboard had Dazai's head aching worse. His eyes flicked briefly to the pawns, hunched into themselves and wielding 2 stone swords each. Dazai was almost sure of it. "Because I know how to play chess. You'll just get yourself stabbed." Really, this was just playing chess. And Dazai was exceptionally well practiced in chess. Except, in addition to the king, if you lose the castle or the bishop, you also lose. With a sigh, Dazai thought, "Worst case scenario, I destroy the board itself." No longer human was already itching to do as much. But if Dazai could spare himself from passing out, he would. Looking between the twins, they still didn't look convinced. It was that horrible, unending concern leaking out from behind their eyes, and no trivial amount of uncertainty. Dazai pouted in mock hurt. "You don't trust me to win, and to think I believed you were loyal subordinates." "Ah," George said, taking a conscious step back. "It's not that, Snakey." Fred nodded insistently. "We're just worried. These pieces were made to keep Quirrell out. If one of you gets hurt." "We won't," Dazai assured them. Then, if only to get them to settle down, he added, "I know chess. Trust me as your boss." He paused. "Or, if it helps, you can trust me as a friend, or whatever." The twins shared one of their looks. Then, with a final glance to Blaze, who merely shrugged, a type of agreeable tilt to his lips, they grinned. "Of course we trust our boss, but the whole gang falls apart if you're too hurt to lead us." Fred nodded. "So we're only a little overprotective." Agreeable as ever, George hummed, "It's a big brother thing." Dazai rolled his eyes, then waved them off. "All right, that's enough. Go sit down. Blaze and I have work to do, so save your fussing for after we win the game. And get the stone," Blaze added. And get the stone because even chess was worthless if there wasn't an end goal. Whether that was playing along with Mori's whims, dominating his subordinates mentally, or stealing an immortality-granting stone, there was always something. "All right," Dazai said, clapping his hands. Across the room, Fred and George were settling in against the stone wall, finally. They looked stiff and uncomfortable. He would have to make this fast. Twirling on his feet, Dazai grinned to Blaze. "Take the castle spot. I'll play the bishop, since I'm the brains of this operation." Blaze shot him a nonplussed look, but took a step towards the blank space regardless. "That has nothing to do with being the bishop. At least pick a believable reason." Dazai shrugged. Because Blaze was a foot ahead of him, the other boy was the first to step onto the massive chessboard. Dazai watched, eyes narrowed and breath stilled, as Blaze crossed the threshold. He waited with muscles tense for something to happen, for the magicked pieces to slay Blaze in place. Only, after a few more steps, the chess pieces didn't even twitch. They remained as still as stone long enough for Blaze to come to a stop in the empty black castle's domain. He tapped his heel against the blank white tile, and Dazai let out a sigh. With a nod to Blaze, Dazai continued across the board. His feet clicked on the cold tile, echoing around the room quietly. The second Dazai touched the board, he felt the magic tenfold. If it hadn't been obvious before, it was now. This chess set was overflowing with magic. As Dazai walked past the towering queen and king, he was careful to avoid touching them. He was already limited in his use of the one bishop and castle. Nullifying any other pieces was too much of a handicap. Before Dazai reached the bishop's empty black square, Dazai turned to face the white pieces. They were just as massive and oppressive as their black counterparts were. Dazai could feel how their magic ached to move across the board almost as much as no longer human ached to dry them out. Dazai took a slow step toward a white pawn. His eyes narrowed, intent on getting a better feel of what charm was powering them. Whatever it was certainly more complicated than the twins' charm for making books fly. However, before Dazai could take another step, the pawn suddenly twitched to life. Dazai jumped back a square just as the stone jolted to attention, drawing dual swords to its sides. The twins shouted from across the room, but Dazai was quick to reassure them. "I was just checking, it's fine." Sure enough, when Dazai returned to the black side of the board, the pawn returned to its resting state. Dazai glanced over his shoulder to see Fred and George halfway to standing back up. He placated them with an easy smile. "But it does look dangerous." Dazai hummed. He turned to Blaze. "We'll have to win the game. Otherwise they'll cut us up with those swords when we try to pass. I want to play this really safe." He tilted his head up at the other end of the room, where the next door waited for them. "Let me call the shots." When Blaze immediately agreed, Dazai let himself fall back into position. The bishop's tile was a clean black marble. Dazai felt it hum with magic beneath his shoes, and slipped his hands under his cloak self-consciously. Standing beside the real pieces, the Black King and the Knight, Dazai was incredibly small, fragile. He would have to play this game carefully, he knew. The real question was, how good was McGonagall at chess? Dazai silently berated himself for not taking the time to dissect the Transfiguration professor's mind. He'd been more focused on Snape and Quirrell, but that was no excuse. Dazai met Blaze's eye from across the board while peeking around the king's long shadow. When the other snake grinned, Dazai let himself relax a little. Then, without warning, a white pawn moved. It slid forward across the board 2 paces, with the sound of grinding stone to mark its march. Once it reached its destination, the room grew silent once more. Dazai let out a breath. "You've got this, boss!" "Go, Snakey," Fred cheered. "Go, Blaze." Dazai blinked up from the opposing pawn, 1,000 battle strategies already buzzing around in his skull. At the wall, the twins were cheering and waving enthusiastically. Dazai wondered if he should scold them for being so blasé, but supposed this was better than the alternative. He spared a brief glance to Blaze, but the other boy only nodded. "Good luck." With that, the final bit of tension in Dazai's spine eased out. "I don't need luck," he said. "This is all skill, you know." It was. Mori wouldn't have anything less, and now, for Blaze and the twins, neither would Dazai. "E7 to E5, Dazai called to the empty room. He waited for half a second. Then, the pawn guarding his king slowly marched forward until it was nose to nose with the forward-bound white pawn. They stared one another down through stone eyes. Dazai's eyes narrowed, analyzing the board and all his potential moves. Outwardly, he was squinting through the dim light. However, in Dazai's mind, the pieces were 10, 20, 30 moves ahead. Every possible play the enemy could make, Dazai could already foresee. The only thing limiting Dazai's plan was how desperately he needed to keep Blaze's castle and his own bishop tucked away, safe. The sound of stone on stone tore Dazai from his thoughts abruptly. A white pawn snaked across the board to stand beside its brother at F4. Dazai blinked, furrowed his brow, then blinked again. A king's gambit opening. Dazai could work with that, but... The game unraveled itself in Dazai's mind. Chess was a game of logic, in the end, and with Mori as his teacher, Dazai had learned how to view everything through a purely logical lens. It was the reason why Dazai refused to name his pet and held a strong dislike for the chaotic way Hogwarts was organized. There was absolutely no room for any of that sentimentality or illogicality in chess. Not if you wanted to win, unless your best friend was one of the pieces, in which case, Dazai took a deep breath and walked across the board, through the opening his pawn had made, and stopped at CC5. Dazai! Blaze hissed from his own stationary position. What are you doing? Dazai hummed, rolling back on his heels. Playing chess. Probably winning. Why? The look Blaze sent him was somewhere near scathing. It was also laced with worry, and Dazai quickly looked away. What happened to playing it safe? You're standing in the middle of the board, Dazai? Before Dazai could respond, the white pieces made their counter. A white knight slid across the board before stopping behind one of its pawns. Ignoring the quiet uncertainties rising up from his gang, Dazai countered almost immediately. D6. His pawn moved forward. Shortly after, a white pawn did the same to C3. Dazai mutely ran through his option again, before finally settling on bishop to G4. Everything was going smoothly. But it was really only a matter of time before something happened. Just as Dazai was considering this, white made its next move. One of the pawns that had pushed forward turned on its base until it was facing Dazai's pawn. Then, with striking speed, it raised its stone blades into the sky. It slashed downward. There was a thundering boom as stone tore into stone. Immediately, the black pawn crumbled, heavy stones smashing onto the board and skidding along the tile. The black pawn collapsed, defeated and utterly destroyed. A fracture of stone smacked into Dazai's shoe. There was no magic left in the stone. It was dead. There was a hushed silence. Dazai could envision it, was sure that the others were thinking the same, one of those towering pieces striking him down. Striking Blaze down. We should stop, one of the twins called out from the wall. Fred and George were both standing now, looking slightly shaken on their feet. A fracture of the broken pawn skittered to a stop at their feet. I knew it. This is too dangerous. More dangerous than that stupid dog? Dazai asked, frowning. Or the plant that tried to suffocate you? He kicked the stone away with a small frown. George shook his head. We didn't know about those ones. It's not too late to stop. We all just saw what happened to that pawn. That could be one of you. Dazai closed his eyes and thought. The near-frantic voices of the twins washed over him, but they didn't move to the board, too cautious about being slain themselves. We're always telling you to take care of yourself, George tried. Or practice self-control, Blaze added. This is one of those times when you should really listen to us. I'm not just going to watch you get yourself seriously hurt. Or... Pawn take on E5, Dazai said instead. He opened his eyes to a suddenly near-silent room. As Dazai's own black pawn slowly raised its blades, Fred warned, Dazai, you all worry too much. He huffed out a breath, pointedly ignoring the tight, betrayed feeling bubbling in his chest. I can win this. As he spoke, the opposing white pawn was torn to pieces. There was a loud clatter of stone shattering, followed by a heavy silence. This is too dangerous, George cut in. His voice was a far cry from the usual levity it carried. If one of them gets you, that won't happen. Dazai turned away to watch the white queen push across the board. It shoved aside the broken pawn's head on its path and came to a stop 4 spaces in front of Blaze. It couldn't take him, of course. Dazai was purposefully keeping the right castle, Blaze, guarded on all sides. The pawn protecting Blaze stared down the white queen, and Dazai stood open in the middle of the board, defended that pawn. It wasn't that precarious. But Dazai supposed he could understand their worry. There were chunks of broken pawns scattered all across the board after all. Bone could break just as easily. Trust me, Dazai said, calling forth the knight beside Blaze with a passive command. It left Blaze's side, but didn't leave him undefended. Dazai could see their worry, could see how they wanted him to get off the board before the opponent made a move he couldn't counter. But Dazai knew with all his cold, logical brain that he could win this. A white knight rode across the board, then crushed a black pawn under its hooves. Dazai paid it no mind, sending up a knight of his own to pressure one of White's pawns. At the wall, the twins didn't settle back down, but they did hold their tongues now. They watched with wide eyes as another white pawn pushed across the board. It came to rest one spot diagonal to Dazai. Dazai blinked up at the pawn. From his position, pawn wasn't quite the right word. It towered over him, a massive stone man wielding dual swords. Behind him, Fred, George, and Blaze all drew in joint breaths. In one turn, Dazai could be taken out. But, Dazai, you worry too much, he sniped back. If that pawn kills me here, Blaze will just take the queen. It's an illogical trade, and White won't take it. It's fine. And it was. He tried to project as much certainty into his voice, but irritation won out in the end. Fred and George spent so much time worrying they didn't even realize Dazai was about to win. Quickest game he'd played in a while, honestly. Once they were done with this stone nonsense, Dazai was going to march right up to McGonagall and tell her off for so-called chess skills. Sorry, boss. Dazai frowned, then whirled on his tile to see Blaze, who was still tucked away behind a line of pawns. Apology accepted. He hummed. What did you do? You're right, Blaze said in explanation. You have absolutely no self-preservation skills, so we worry. A lot. Unwittingly, that horrible three-headed dog flashed in Dazai's head. He had needed their worry then, he supposed. It had carried him from the room and into that disgustingly reassuring conversation with Blaze. Dazai let his eyes narrow a bit at the thought, felt his skin prickle, because this was different. This was Dazai taking care of them, his gang members. But, Blaze continued, this is important to you, right? So we should trust that you'll do everything you can to win. Dazai felt his nose scrunch up. Then, pouting, he said, You should trust me because I'm your boss, but you're not entirely wrong either. Oh, Fred and George said together. Dazai had to crane his neck to see them properly. We're sorry for doubting you too. You've really got this under control? Obviously. He puffed out a breath. And you're not sorry at all. Fred shrugged, but didn't disagree. It's a part of being your older brother, Snakey. Someone's got to worry about you. Blaze nodded to him, and the twins reluctantly settled back against the wall. Dazai let out a calming breath, and castled his king. The sound of rock scraping against rock calmed Dazai's thoughts somewhat. At the very least, it kept him from hearing any more declarations of concern from his subordinates. With the king safely hidden in the corner, and the non-Blaze rook prepared to attack if necessary, Dazai felt victory edge closer to reality. It was silent for a long moment. Dazai eyed the pawn's marble blades with no air in his chest. For a second, he did nothing but stare to see if the pawn would move, would strike him down and splatter his blood across the black and white tiles. Instead, a white bishop marched across the board. Dazai nodded. Behind him, he heard his subordinates let out sighs of relief. The game was nearly over now. Unknowingly, Professor McGonagall's magic chess pieces had just made a horrible game-ending mistake. Knight takes on e5. White's pawn takes back on e5. Knight takes on e4. And, black and white stone shattered all across the tiled floor, Queen takes on e4. Dazai winced back as a shard of stone shot through the air, narrowly slicing his cheek. A small tear of blood rolled down his chin and splattered against the black tile at his feet. He hummed in the silence, and it was silent. All at once, the pieces had stopped moving. Whatever magic was keeping them alive flickered out and died. Dazai felt it disperse into the air and buzz around quietly. It tickled against his skin and burned at the open cut on his face. With a nod, Dazai stepped forward. Dazai, George called, panicked. Dazai whirled on his feet and blinked. What? You're... he gasped. Wait, why aren't they attacking you? Amusement bubbled up in Dazai's chest. After a second, it revealed itself as a light titter. Because we won. Now hurry up. Won! Their footsteps clattered loudly against the tile as the twins raced across the board and reach him. Blaze got to Dazai first, an indescribable look on his face. Good job, boss. Not that I'm surprised. Dazai raised a brow. Maybe a little surprised. He amended. You didn't have to put yourself at risk like that, you know. It wasn't really a risk. You'd know that if you were any better at chess. Before he could get the last word out, the twins were smothering Dazai between their chests in a hug. Dazai blinked. His mouth dropped open and arms tense at his sides. There was something warm about the way their arms wrapped around him, but the blood of adrenaline was still pounding in Dazai's chest. It made his skin prickle. It wasn't even a second before Dazai tried to squirm out of Fred and George's embrace. They let him go immediately, and Dazai let out a breath at that. Still, the twins didn't step away. They hovered right at his side, eyes pressed into an emotion Dazai couldn't quite decipher. He crossed his arms and watched them. You scared us, Snakey, Fred whined. At his side, George nodded emphatically. I told you, Dazai stated, taking a step towards Blaze. I was going to win. The twins brushed him off immediately. Doesn't mean we can't worry. You could be 100% certain and we'd still be concerned when you're walking right into danger like that. Dazai frowned, remembering all the times that Fred and George had fussed over him. Mostly he was thinking about Quirrell. They had tried to stop him from doing things like this in the past, hadn't they? Still, there was a fine line between a protective subordinate and a controlling one. Dazai bristled at the betraying heat in his cheeks. Dazai. He turned to see Blaze watching them with a dull expression on his face. What? I think, Blaze said, you should just accept that people care about you now. Dazai felt his whole face scrunch up in displeasure before the words had even registered. Now? Don't be weird, he grumbled, feeling warm. Just congratulate me on being way smarter than Professor McGonagall, and let's move on. Fred and George gave Dazai an accommodating pair of smiles. Sure, Fred hummed. How'd you win anyway? The White King is trapped, Dazai explained with a nod. Or it would have been in one move. I guess whatever magic was in those pieces knew it was a lost cause. See? He gestured vaguely to the board. No matter where the White King goes, I can capture it. Check and mate. Scattered around the board, the black bishops and the queen had pinned the king in place. It would only have taken one more move to force defeat. Since the first move, everything had been lined up in Dazai's favor. Feeling self-satisfied, Dazai smirked in Blaze's direction. I told you I was going to play it safe. Absolutely nothing about putting yourself in the middle of the board looked safe. Well, Dazai shrugged. By safe, I of course meant as quickly as possible. What was that, 10 moves? That feels fast. Fast is not safe. It's risky. You're a spoilsport, Blaze. We won, didn't we? Where's my congratulations already? Dazai pouted. Blaze raised an unamused brow. You wriggled out of your congratulation hug-on like it physically pained you. It did. Dazai nodded, and the words weren't entirely a lie. Having friends was strange. It was making him soft in all sorts of ways. A mafioso shouldn't be soft like that, but a good leader should always know when to accept support from one's subordinates. So, 2 more trials, Dazai told them, Quirrell and Snape. Whatever guards they have, I trust you 3 will have my back. Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.